Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are watching me from. I want to take this chance to welcome you once again to this channel. I am Professor Oriaso Odongo, and my channel is Professor Oriaso Odongo's Knowledge Hub. I want to take you through socioeconomic research methods. I remember previously on this very channel, I mentioned to you about general research methods, particularly the modern research methods in climate change adaptation. And I did mention where we came from, the natural science, positivism. We talked about the qualitative, and we went through mixed method or multidisciplinarity, and even the newer one, transdisciplinarity. And I promised to come back again. So today, I want to get you through socioeconomic research methods of climate change. And why I'm talking about this is because I had said that when you are studying climate change in a very comprehensive manner, you've got to include both the biophysical and socioeconomic methodology. So take, for example, socioeconomic methods. Now, these methods are actually built on the belief that climate change is a humanistic or a socioeconomic activity or process. So it's not just a biophysical process. It affects people, communities, institutions, and livelihoods. And it is caused also by human activities. Now, the solutions of climate change also lie in human responses, human activities. Talk about climate mitigation, talk about climate change adaptations, talk about even early warning systems, that like that. But then when we are talking about climate change as a socioeconomic, then we envisage that even the response of climate change happens through society and the societal processes, as it were. So today, allow me to pick about 3 processes of socioeconomic research or approaches. The first one is quantitative method. Ladies and gentlemen, quantitative research methods are not possibly new to you. They are actually methods of inquiry, as it were, and largely developing from positivism into new modern science. So quantitative methods are systematic methods of gathering information. You gather data using them. And what is very unique is that we even end up performing computational or statistical operations. You know all of them. And this is because the data that we rely on within this methodology are numeric in nature. They are figures, they exist in values, as it were. So this method is normally believed to be most objective. People believe it is very elaborate and investigational. So if you were to do a study, then they say use a method that is very investigational, as it were. So you collect data using structured methods so that if somebody else has to also go after you, they would actually use the same method and arrive at the same answers or results, for example. So you collect data through scientific methods from entities, like from respondents, from subjects, and these subjects could be representing the population or the target population or the units that we are talking about. So people normally believe this method because it's almost aligned with the parameters, aligned with the principles and the rules of the natural science. Look, for example, at the confidence level. So confidence level or level of significance is very important in every research, and it is the one that normally depicts or tries to prove or demonstrate that your results are almost watertight. So they say that quantitative studies are having very high level of significance or confidence. And to a large extent, they rely on primary data. They also rely on secondary data. And this data exists there in the field or even in data banks. And some of them today even exist as big data that is mined. And so we used a number of approaches and methods when we are using quantitative methodology, for example. Think about the census method. When you use census, you kind of collect data from the entire population. Maybe you want to document population of a country, of a region, or even a district. Or you want to go to a community to study how they battle climate change. And your intention is to study each and every member of that community, look at the census method, we also use the survey methodology. And survey is quite different, and its confidence level is slightly lower than that of census, because you select from the population just a bit of it, or a fraction that we normally call the sample. And so with the sample, you can study them, and you're able to depict that whatever you are looking at, it comes from the entire population. Surveys come in different nature, like cross-sectional, the one which takes place within a place at a point in time, or they can be longitudinal, the one which takes place in a place over a long period of time. And they can be around correlation. So we talk about correlational studies, which you commission them to establish relationships that exist among variables, for example, like what impacts a variable has on another one, or what changes will happen when you bring in a variable. So those ones are correlational studies. So we also have causal comparative studies, as it were. These ones are drawing conclusions as cause effects. And you hear people say A leads to B, and C, something like that is causal comparative studies. And we also have experimental approaches, experimental methods. You are not very unfamiliar with experiments. Experiments initially were meant to really prove or disprove some theory of some sort, and the intention of experiment is to falsify or challenge a position, as it were. But then it happens in both natural and social science, and people use it a great deal, even though the one that people use in social science could be more quasi-experimental. So it means an experimental method that is a bit tempered, so that it does not have all the parameters that define the purely experimental methodology. So quantitative studies are having features that could be characteristic with them, that they are normally meant to describe the state of affairs. They don't go into details. Like if you wanted depth, you may not get depth from quantitative, as it were. They also use just structured tools, like look at scales, look at polls, look at questionnaires that people frequently use. They also use representative samples and scientific method of sampling. And I talked about census. If it is census, everyone else in the target population is going to be used. But if it is a survey, you won't take a fraction of it. But that fraction is able to explain to you parameters within the entire population. They sometimes use close-ended questions for uniformity. They also rely on previous studies or even previous theories, as it were. They collect and analyze just quantitative data, the way we had said, and the results are generalizable to similar context. People believe that they have merit over other methodologies, say qualitative, because scientists have proven, because it is directly related to positivism or natural science, it collects reliable and accurate data. That's what people think, that that data will give honest opinion without certain discrepancies. And data collection methods are quite quick and rather straightforward. It's not about beating the bush. And you will also have numerical data and a wide range of data analysis methods, which is increasing the scope of data analysis. Maybe if you were to look at the qualitative, that's restricted to certain methods that are friendly with that method. People also believe that it eliminates biases and personal opinion. I wonder which research in the world has no opinion. But then we also have its demerits. People feel like it is limited in terms of what it is able to research. Look at what I said first in terms of its weakness. It is to a large extent limited to the current state of affairs. So it does answer to where, when, and even the extent question, and may not get into the detail of where, why, and so many other questions. So it's not well suited to investigating certain complex issues. We know societies are made up of high-level complexities, There is how this relate with that, and this also had to relate with the other one. So look at that complex web of societies, as it were. So if you were to really trust this method alone, then you might end up leaving other parts. And it is susceptible to manipulation. Sometimes the approaches that people use in research, for example, if you take the approach of theory, then research, or deductive approach is where commissioning a study is preceded by thinking about doing some desktop study, identifying theory that goes with it, and confirming methods that you'll be using to do that. That is already confining you. So it's already manipulating you in terms of even the answers that you get. And it has a lot of criticism. And people say that if you wanted to, for example, develop a theory, then it is not one of the best methods to use, because it begins from a theory. So probably you are able to only modify the theory. You are able to confirm or maybe refute a theory that is existing if you were to take a study through this method alone. And sometimes it leads to suspicion between the researcher and the researched, because to a large extent, people who use this method are still so much into the purist of natural science. So they believe that the people you are researching must not be very close to you, because they may affect you, or they may really influence you and even the data, which will cause some level of biasness. So in this method, ladies and gentlemen, certain concepts are here to contend with. Like look at research problem, for example. So what is the problem? What originates the intent of the study? What question or what issue exists? And this issue is definable through research or studies already commissioned. What gaps have they left? And we also talk about the practical problem in the environment. So if you were to commission a very good study that has been well problematized, imagine it has both the research study gap and also the practical problem that exists there. More so if you were to take the transdisciplinary approach that I will present later. We talk about the unit of analysis, and this is the locus or the focus of the problem. Is it focusing on individual? Is it focusing on group? Is it focusing on institutions? Or is it focusing on country or region or at global level? Which specific unit of analysis are you talking about? Then population, target population, as it were. So in that, whom are you studying? Whom will your study be generalized to? Then the variables, these are properties or attributes that are supposed to be identified and measured, for example. And we have three main ones. We have the dependent variable, the independent variable, and the intervening variables that we normally contend with. The dependent ones are the variables whose change is supposed to be explained. Some people call it a criterion variable. And then the dependent one is a variable that you think will induce the change that you're looking for in the dependent variable, for example. We call that the explanatory or predictor variable. Don't forget that. Then the last one is the intervening variables, which also has got the capability of affecting the relationship, even though it is not the subject of the current study. So you, to a large extent, want to limit its impact as much as possible, so that you only remain with determining association of independent and dependent variables. Then it also comes in with hypotheses, the tentative answers or research questions that every researcher, before they study, they even think about solution to the problem. And this thinking should not go overboard, so we call it educated guess. It's possible that before a study you are able to suggest what the possible answers will be. Sometimes this you can be helped through the theory that you have chosen. Many people do so, and look at a dimension of a theory, for example, and check the extent to which data can be available to prove or disprove that one. And then we think about issues like population, samples, sampling techniques, and procedures. And the idea of sample comes to mind quite clearly. And sample is a representation of the population. So the actual subjects or respondents or people or units that you study, so that after studying them, you believe that you have studied the entire population. It's the sample. The sample can be small, it can be big, it can be ideal, of which case the ideal one is just 10% of the target population. So if you had a population of 100 in a community, then you wanted to do ideal, then it is 10%, which is around 10. If you select it well, it can give you very high confidence level and the study will still stand. But if normally the general principle of sampling is whenever you are studying, the bigger the sample, the better. Because imagine we had said that census method and survey, census is more convincing and more believable because data has been got from almost everybody. You can imagine that. And then big sample is also there. So the principle of getting to small sample, the principle of getting to big sample or ideal sample. So then we say quickly in this, I'll just give you a hint that if the target population is big, and you know what I mean by big, you will always go for a small sample. Let's say if it was big like 5 million, if you take 10% of that, the number would be astronomical. You cannot study that, so you take small sample. But if the target population is small, and you know what small here means, you tend to go for bigger sample. And you can imagine, if I had 10 students in a class and I wanted to select, if I went for 10%, that is just one. So I'll be forced to take a number that is slightly larger than or bigger than the 10%, which is ideal. That is what can really help. And so the issues like sample frame also comes here. What is a sample frame? A register or a list where you can get your sample from. And it is more or less similar to target population, but it's confined to accessible population, if you know what that term means. So you look at that sample frame, and sample frame is so important in quantitative studies. So then what is adequate sample size? So I say that if you were to examine as to whether the sample size is adequate or not adequate, then you think about the population size. It will give you that. And even the level of confidence or significance that you require. Generally, we require around 95% confidence level, something like that. So if the population is big, you know how many to pick. If it is small, you also know how to pick. Then after doing that, you use scientific methods or scientific formulas that are existing to be able to carve out the sample that you want. Like you can quickly refer to these scholars like Borg and Gold, 2003. It says that if population exists in hundreds, between 100 and 999, you take percentage like 30%, 40%, that's enough, or even 20%. Or you go for scholars who have told us how to select from bigger sample. Look at Cochrane formula, for example, for large populations. Or you can go into the Fisher formula. Fisher is coming up with the formula for disproportionate sampling. So if population is stratified or is clustered in a way that you'd wish to get out definite number from each category, then you'll be going for that. Or you go for Slovene formula. Or you even go for Yamane 1957. There are a number of scholars or people who have come up with formulas that you can use to derive sample size from populations that are known, particularly for the sake of quantitative studies. And I also want to think about quite a lot of other issues here. And probably you can look at data analysis. So how do you analyze quantitative data? A number of methods, I think we had said, because we look at the numerical data here. And so you'll be forced to manage them in a professional way. So you sort them, you code them, do entry, and then you process them. And there exist tools that we can use. Say, for example, statistical package for social sciences. or even Excel sheets that we are having. So you can even generate code sheets. You develop code sheets that you now work from, and from there you're able to use descriptive and inferential statistics. Look at that so that you package or manage your data in an acceptable manner so that you can make deductions, you can make predictions about the population. So when you properly analyze your data, you are able to make inferences, you are able to make deductions, you are able to generalize. And then there are key methodologies that we look at in data analysis. We look at the descriptive and inferential statistics. Those are things that I think are not very new to us. If you talk about descriptive statistics, there are measures that normally provide the descriptions of a population, and either by numerical calculations, and you place them in graphs on charts or even tables. And the major types of descriptive statistics that we know everywhere and of it could be measures of frequency. Look at measures of frequency, like count, percent, and frequency, as it were. Then we also have measures of central tendency, like mean, median, and mode. We've been playing around with this, and you see how it's a measure of central tendency. We also have measures of dispersion, like range, variance, and standard deviations. Those are measures that you know very well. We also have measures of dispersion. Look at that. We also have measures of position, like percentile ranks, quartile ranks, and that. And then we also have measures of skewedness, what we call measures of catharsis, and also the normal distribution or normal curves that we keep on using. These are important descriptive statistics that you find yourself using when you pick on quantitative methods. And with regard to inferential statistics, these inferential statistics are very unique in that they normally determine the generalizability or the extent to which results that you have got from your research are able to be applied to the general population. And you imagine the types that we are having. I've mentioned a few of them, like correlation analysis. So where do we run correlation analysis? When we want to examine the relationship between independent and dependent variables, or the way they associate, or the degree of association, as it were. Then number two, we have the regression analysis that we also run, used to examine causal relationship between independent variables themselves. So you could have independent variables, and they also relate, they influence and affect one another, and you want to show that. You want to show, for example, how education and age and sex could affect climate knowledge, for example. So how is education, age, sex related in a manner that enable or influence our perception of that? You can do that. And you also look at analysis of variance, what people call ANOVA. ANOVA is used to compare means. So you have univariate and multivariate analysis that people normally run. And then we have cross tabulations. People use tables with parameters there. You can use that to show multiple variables. You can use that and how those variables affect an outcome or a result or a thing. People even go to use student t-tests, for example. You compare two means at a time. And then we also have chi-square. Chi-square, you also have heard about it. Testing association between two categorical variables. And then lastly, you could look at trend analysis. What people normally use time series analysis, if you remember time series analysis. And the trend analysis, you look at trends, recurrence of a pattern, for example. You want to prove that climate change is real. Then you look at a 30-year period, say from 2000 all the way to 2030, for example, and you see the trend. That trend is able to give you a picture of things that can be corroborated even using lay knowledge. Somebody can tell you in this year that you have seen a change in the graph movement. Something happened. You can look at that. People also use time series analysis or trend analysis to also predict what will happen. We have had predictions of what will happen if the situation continues. We call it business as usual. So if we have business as usual with regard to climate change, what situation are we likely to see in 2050 or 2100? This is a projection that is easily discernible through trend analysis. You can have that. And then now we go to how do we select the sample we have been talking about for quantitative studies. So we have two main approaches or two main strategies for selecting the sample that we have described, the scientific and the non-scientific. The scientific method is what we call the probability method or random sampling. And the non-scientific one is what we call the non-probabilistic method. So if you use scientific method, and I would recommend that if you are doing quantitative studies, try as much as possible to use scientific method of selecting sample, where you give every person or every entity an equal chances of being picked to become a sample. If you have a population of, say, 100 members of the community you are studying with regard to their perception around climate change, and you give each of them equal chances of being studied, then we say you are using a scientific means. So how can we give them equal chances? Maybe through strategies like simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, cluster random sampling. You can use even systematic random sampling and even multi-random. So each and every one of those methodologies assure some objectivity. If it is simple, it is as simple as even total 649, or even giving people button and trying to call out who has got which button, or trying to select those buttons in a way that does not give people obvious chance or somebody obvious chance of being picked. But if it is stratified, it means that you are able to disaggregate with regard to geography or demographics, those variables. And if it is systematic, it means that there exists a list or a register from where you are going to pick, and you use what we call intervals. So those intervals are important. But then you talk about multiple random sampling, it means you're able to use a number of methods to lead you into the sample. And again, we also have non-scientific sampling. I'm not saying that if you are doing the quantitative, you don't use them. You can use them, particularly with certain respondents or subjects that would help fill up your study. And here you don't give each person or each entity equal chance of being selected. That's why they are called biased sampling. So they include like convenient sampling. If you select somebody to be part of your sample simply because they are close to you or you have just met them. They can be volunteer. If you select somebody to be part of your sample simply because they have agreed to participate. Or if you use quota sampling, where you designate portions for regions that we are talking about, designating portions. Or if you use Noble method, the dung beetle method, you identify a first case through any means, and then you use the first case you identify to lead you into several other cases. For example, in a study that is very sensitive, and too sensitive for you to obviously find the people who you can study. If you have judgmental and purposive, if you know that if you know where you can get the data, you go straight to the person who will give you, other than beating about the bush. So if you look at those techniques, you quickly use them to get yourself non-scientific data. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I've talked quite a lot about quantitative methods and talked about the merits, talked about the demerits, about manipulation, about lack of trust with subjects. I talked about certain critical concepts that are defining it. I talked about population sampling and how to sample. And I've talked about how to manage data, how to process data there. And I still promise that we have a lot to offer. And so please don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, because I have more lined up sessions that are very engaging, that are going to be very interesting and exciting. Thank you so much.